in 2009 for the first Exopolitics conference in Sitges. So I'm very happy that this conference has been organised here in Montserrat, which is really wonderful for me and my wife to come and be a part of this. I began my interest in the study of UFOs and extraterrestrial life in 2001, and that was because I saw the Disclosure Project press conference organised by Dr. Stephen Greer in Washington DC, and I was actually living in Washington DC at the time. I was actually working at American University as a full-time professor in international politics. And when I saw the video of that press conference, I was convinced that this was a very important phenomenon, that there was a cover-up of UFOs and that this UFO phenomenon was very much connected to extraterrestrial life. Well, now, 16 years after my involvement in this study of UFOs and extraterrestrial life, I'm now convinced that if we just look at the UFO phenomenon as a question of extraterrestrial visitation, then we are really being very simplistic. We are underestimating exactly what is happening. Because now I'm convinced with the most recent research that I've been doing that much of the UFO phenomenon actually involves secret space programs. Though the question of extraterrestrial life is still very relevant, and I still believe that the evidence shows that we are being visited by extraterrestrials, there are also incredibly advanced space vehicles that belong to various governments, and in particular the US government. The United States Navy has been a very big player when it comes to the development of a secret space program. So in terms of understanding the real history of the US Navy's secret space program and how that's connected to the question of extraterrestrial life, I want to begin with someone that I believe really helps us understand how this all began for the Navy. And this is a man who recently passed away. His name is William Tompkins, and in 1940, 1941, because of his abilities, he was recruited by the Office of Naval Intelligence because he had incredible memory for understanding ship design, complex placement of armaments, radar. He had an eidetic or photographic memory. And so this was someone that the United States Navy wanted to recruit into their program, into a classified program that they were putting together. But first they began to train him. So here's a photo of him showing his models to a lieutenant in the United States Navy. And he also had letters of recognition by US captains and US admiral as well. And at this time he was only 17 years old. So this is very rare that a 17-year-old boy still in high school has US Navy captains and admirals talking about him, meeting him and discussing him because his abilities were so great. So he was recruited into the US Navy because of his skills. He talks about his history, his background in the US Navy, why he was recruited into this program in his book, Selected by Extraterrestrials, and I very much recommend it to anyone wanting to know how he became involved in various programs that the US Navy began. He was involved in a very famous incident in 1942. At this time, in February 1942, he was just 18 years old, and he was already someone that had been prepared for working for the Office of Naval Intelligence to work in classified experimental aircraft research. And in 1942, he was a witness to the Los Angeles air raid. This was a very famous incident in US history where on the night of February 24, 25, there was a very large UFO which appeared with smaller UFOs all around it. They were brilliantly lit. They had some internal lighting system that lit them up. And the US Army and the Navy had ships in the ports at the time. They opened up an artillery barrage because this was after the Pearl Harbor attack. So they thought that this might have been a sneak Japanese attack. But the thing was that these craft didn't attack, they just hovered over Los Angeles. And basically this was something that William Tompkins witnessed. They just hovered because this was a technology that was not yet developed at the time. Helicopters were still experimental. They were just developing the very first helicopters at the time. So there was no way a helicopter would be able to silently hover above Los Angeles for several hours with over 1,000 rounds of artillery being shot at it. So this was a very unusual craft that was there. So this was William Tompkins' description of the event. So I'll just read it out for those English speakers. Quote, just after midnight, the air raid sirens and anti-aircraft guns of the coastal artillery woke everyone up. We ran out onto the street and saw a large round craft above 7,000 feet up, floating in the air above us. It slowed to a stop right overhead and remained stationary. It was lit up by 8 searchlights while anti-aircraft shells burst all around and against it. Most of the shells exploded on the bottom of the craft. We just couldn't believe the thing hadn't exploded or been shot down. 3, then 5 other ships appeared near it. Some of the searchlights, as well as the anti-aircraft teams, focused on each one as they passed the first object. Eventually, the first craft slowly departed as well. So the official reaction by the authorities at the time, publicly they basically said that this was nothing special. So the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, he basically said that the air raid and the firing of the artillery shells at this stationary UFO hovering over Los Angeles for several hours, being lit up by searchlights, thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people saw this. It was well photographed. He said it was just jittery nerves. So the Navy Secretary thought that there was nothing to this publicly. The Army said that there was something there, but they didn't know what it was, so it's more important to focus on the war and just forget about it. So both the official statements by the Army Secretary and the Navy Secretary were that there was nothing really for the public to be concerned about, that whatever this UFO was, they couldn't explain it, and that people had to focus on the war effort. So that was the official reaction, publicly. But at a classified level, what was really happening was something very different. And we know that because there was a leaked document. This is one of the famous Majestic documents. And it says that the 2 of the objects that were hovering above Los Angeles on that night of February 24th, 2 of them were recovered after that night. Now, either the artillery shells shot them down, or maybe there was a malfunction of some sort, but the Army and the Navy each recovered one of the UFOs. And these were advanced technologies. These were not technologies known to the US military at the time. These were not technologies that the Japanese or Nazi Germany had developed. These were extraterrestrial technologies. And this is what the report says, that this was something that was beyond human engineering at that time. And so one or both of the craft were taken to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, which is the premier US Air Force research facility. At the time, it was called the Army Airfield. US Army Airfield ran that. There was a FBI memo, a document that confirms that Wright Field was where recovered UFOs were taken. And so this is an authentic FBI document that has been released, and it shows that, that the 1947 Roswell crash was taken to Wright Field. So I'm telling you this because it's important to understand that Wright Field is and continues to be the place where foreign technology is studied by the US Air Force. Any kind of foreign technology, whether it comes from Germany, Russia, or some extraterrestrial civilization, is going to be taken to Dayton, Ohio, because that's where the Air Force studies these kinds of technologies. But the Navy had its own program. They had something separate to what the Air Force was doing. The Navy, during the Second World War, the Navy program to understand these extraterrestrial technologies that had been recovered from Los Angeles, this was headed by James Forrestal, who was in 1940 became the Undersecretary of the Navy, and then by 1944 became the Secretary of the Navy. And he was, according to William Tompkins, someone that was communicating with Nordic extraterrestrials. So this is something that is very significant, because it says that the man in charge of the US Navy, who was trying to understand what the extraterrestrials were doing and what these technologies that have been recovered from Los Angeles were capable of, was someone that was in communication with a group of extraterrestrials that are very human and look like us, Nordic looking. Any Nordic extraterrestrials here? Raise your hands. We want to just acknowledge you. Oh, we have. Okay. So we have these Nordic extraterrestrials helping the US Navy, according to William Tompkins at the time. That's quite incredible if you think about it. But as I explained through the presentation, there is a good reason for why this was happening, why the Navy was chosen to be an institution that these extraterrestrials wanted to work with. According to Bill Tompkins, the Navy actually chose someone to head this program to study the UFOs that were recovered from the Los Angeles air raid. That it was a young engineer. He was at the time a commander in the US Navy, and he was working out of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington, D.C. So this is what William Tompkins said about him. He said, what's most important here, Secretary of the Navy Forrestal had a communication from Nordics to make a selection of the individual who was to take this Navy espionage program. What's important here is that of the 37 admirals that could have been picked to handle this, an individual who had not been influenced by having graduated from Annapolis or gotten all of the incorrect information about everything on this planet, which is misinformation that's been given to us by the reptilians for at least 5,000 years controlling the planet. End quote. Well, that's quite an incredible statement. Because he's saying that there's another group of extraterrestrials called reptilians who have been in control of the planet for 5,000 years or more, and that they have helped implement an educational system that really doesn't provide the best understanding of science, and that people who are not really thoroughly grounded in this kind of conventional training or scientific training are better able to understand extraterrestrial technologies. So this is important, because he's saying here that the extraterrestrials know that scientists, because they've been conditioned through a certain indoctrination and program, cannot understand extraterrestrial technologies. It's people talented engineers or people who are more open-minded who are able to do this. And one of these people was this young commander in the Navy at the time, Rico Volta. And because he was still open to scientific understanding of unconventional technologies, he was someone that this group of Nordic extraterrestrials said to the Secretary of the Navy he should be the one running this Navy espionage program that was planned at the time for understanding advanced technologies in Nazi Germany. So there's documents that actually helped prove this, that this actually was happening. Here you have one document that comes from the National Archives, the US National Archives, and it shows that at this time, this was the Rico Borda was the commander of the Bureau of Aeronautics Power Plant Department. So this was the division of the Navy which was responsible for developing the most advanced jet engines or the most advanced engines for the Navy's combat aircraft and their bombers that was in part of the war effort. So he had a very important position because he was the head of this department. So here's a document, and the important thing about this document is that it says that on February 25, 1942, he was ordered to travel to Wright Field for an undisclosed mission. Well, as I explained earlier, Wright Field was where the Army Air Force took the craft that had been recovered after the Los Angeles air raid. They took it from Los Angeles all the way to Ohio, the other side of the country, and they took it to Dayton, where this technology was to be studied. And on the very day that they recovered the craft, this Navy commander is ordered to travel from Washington, D.C. to Dayton, Ohio to study something. And I think this is a very important document because it shows that Volta was very much involved in the classified study of some craft that had been recovered from the Los Angeles air raid incident. So according to William Tompkins, he says that this craft that had been recovered from Los Angeles was a gift from the Nordic extraterrestrials to the US Navy. So in other words, this group of human-looking extraterrestrials wanted to help the Navy understand these advanced extraterrestrial technologies because they thought it was going to be important for the Navy for its future and for helping the US in the war against Germany and Japan. That these were unmanned drones. So these were a gift from the Nordics, according to Tompkins, to the US Navy. Again, incredible information. Now, Rico Borda, very quickly, in the space of just over a year, gets promoted from commander to captain, and then from captain to rear admiral. So now he's the rear admiral, and he has two jobs. He has an official job. His official job during the day is at Naval Air Station San Diego, where he's the assembly and repair officer from 1942 to 1946. But during that same period, he was in charge of this Navy espionage program that had spies in Nazi Germany throughout the Second World War. Here's another document from the National Archives, so this is an authentic document, and it shows that Rico Borda, just before he transferred to Naval Air Station San Diego, was actually traveling to these Navy and Air Force experimental aircraft facilities to study the programs that were there. So for someone to be setting up a Navy espionage program to understand experimental aircraft that were being developed in Nazi Germany during World War II, it would be very important for him to travel before he set up this program to US military facilities and corporations that were also studying experimental aircraft designs and jet performance and anything related to this. And so here's a document that shows that this is exactly what he was doing, just as William Tompkins said. Here's a document that says that he travelled to these different aircraft experimental stations. The US Army Air Force experimental station at Muroc in California, which is now Edwards Air Force Base. He travelled to Douglas Aircraft Company, and Douglas Aircraft Company today is part of the Boeing Aircraft Company. But during the Second World War and in the decades after the Second World War, it was one of the US's leading aerospace companies, developing very advanced weapons, weaponized aircraft for the Navy and the Air Force. Then you had Northrop Aircraft. They continue to be involved in experimental aircraft. They now have been involved in designing aircraft carriers for the US Navy. Naval Air Station San Diego. So here's a document that says that San Diego Naval Air Station was very much involved in the study of experimental aircraft, which is where William Tompkins went to work, and the documents prove that this happened. And another company, Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, which is also now being incorporated into Boeing. So this shows that there was a Navy espionage program that was set up, that was run by Admiral Ricklebotham, and that William Tompkins was a part of this. That documents actually prove this. I have a book here that actually has all the documents there for you to look at, the US Navy Secret Space Program. Now, why was Germany a leading nation when it came to experimental aircraft, or things that the Navy believed that was very important for the Navy to understand because of their advanced nature, and that this somehow was related to extraterrestrial life? Why Germany? Well, according to William Tompkins, what the Navy spies learned was that Germany, during the early part of the 1920s, became a pioneer in experimental aircraft because of this lady, Maria Orsich. In 1919, immediately or shortly after the end of the First World War, she formed the Brill Society, which was a German secret society very much interested in higher consciousness, in being able to utilize higher consciousness for developing psychic abilities and for being able to utilize advanced technologies. But these were the sort of things that the Brill Society believed in. And so Maria Orsich was supported by many German secret societies that also believed that higher consciousness was the missing key to evolution as a species, and also being able to master advanced technologies. Because the Germans very much believed in ancient Atlantis, ancient Hyperborea. They believed that the historic text descriptions of advanced human societies that were more technologically evolved than ours were not mythology, that this was actually a reality. And so the Germans were very interested, the German secret societies. So Maria Orsich makes telepathic contact with these beings from Aldebaran, which began to give her information about their world, about their society, about their philosophy, and also about their technology. And they communicate with her through automatic writing, so she is just writing out the telepathic messages they gave her. And that she received technical information in the Sumerian language about building a spacecraft. This was in the early 1920s. She gets this kind of technical information. And it was in Sumerian, so she didn't understand Sumerian, but the Germans at the time had the world's leading scholars in Sumerian, so they deciphered this channeled automatic writing, and they deciphered it, and it turned out that this was instructions for building a spacecraft, or actually, more accurately, not a spacecraft, but a teleportation device. A device that would enable the Brill Society, Osage, and her followers to be able to get in this device, and it would teleport from Earth to Aldebaran, not travel there through space-time as we understand a rocket, but teleport there almost like instantaneously. So, this was incredible information that she had received, and the Germans really believed that this was very important to study, and that's what they did. Prominent members of the Brill Society included Winfried Schumann, who was the professor at the Technical University of Munich at the time, and he was the one that began to assemble the first prototype of this craft that Maria Osage got information on from these extraterrestrials. So here's a document that shows that Professor Schumann was actually part of the Project Paperclip scientists who were summoned to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, because he had experience in electrogravitics and electrostatics and rotating high energy plasma. These were the things, these were the principles that were necessary for developing a kind of teleportation device or a space-time vehicle that could move great distances through space and time very rapidly. That you needed to have electrostatics, high voltage electrostatics, and pressurized plasma, mercury-based plasma, pressurized at high temperature, going around at speeds of 60,000 revolutions per minute or greater. With that kind of those principles, you could manipulate space-time. So this was something he was involved in, and we have a document that suggests that this was exactly what the US military authorities were interested in after the Second World War, because he was summoned to Dayton, Ohio. This document says he was taken to Dayton, Ohio to help the Air Force understand some of the recovered German technologies, the German spacecraft, the prototypes that had been retrieved. He was sent to Dayton, Ohio, whereas von Braun and Oberth and Kurt de Busk, the other German rocket scientists, were sent down to Redstone Army Arsenal in Alabama, because that's where they were studying rocket technologies. So the Germans had rocket technologies, and they also had kind of these flying saucer technologies under development. So this was all being learned from the Navy, from their spies in Germany throughout the war, because everything I've said so far is what Wilton Tompkins says that the Navy spies were reporting back to Naval Air Station San Diego to Admiral Walter, who was then reporting to the Navy Secretary James Forrestal. Now, an interesting part of history is that Maria Osage was very friendly with Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was Croatian, and Maria Osage's father was also Croatian, and he was also an engineer like Tesla. So he and Tesla were friends, and Tesla was introduced, Osage at some point was introduced to Nikola Tesla. Now Tesla, we all know a little bit about his incredible mind and ability to come up with advanced technologies, futuristic technologies. But one of the things that's not well known about Nikola Tesla is that he himself believed that he was an extraterrestrial. He didn't believe he was a human in the conventional sense. There's a book by Arthur Matthews, who was one of Tesla's proteges, and he described how Tesla believed he was an extraterrestrial himself. He said, quote, Tesla said that he believed he came from the planet Venus, and during the landings of a spaceship on my property, the members of that ship said that Tesla was a child from Venus. So according to Arthur Matthews, not only did Tesla believe he was from Venus and that he was, as a young child, brought to Earth and put into a human family, but also extraterrestrials that had contacted Arthur Matthews had told him the same thing. So two different sources telling him the same thing, which gives us an idea of how these Nordic extraterrestrials work. That these human-looking extraterrestrials typically work with scientists or engineers who are open-minded, that haven't been kind of like trained to be kind of rigid and doctrinaire, and so that they would come up with futuristic technologies. This is why Admiral Borda ran the Navy program, and this is part of the reason why Nikola Tesla was such a gifted inventor, because he also operated that way outside of a mainstream scientific paradigm. So this raises the question, if Tesla was a Venusian, who was Maria Orsic? Was she also an extraterrestrial? When the military found out, this is in the book, this is Corey Good, who's going to be talking here tomorrow. Corey Good said in a lecture in February of 2016, he said, quote, when the military found out about Meyer's case, Billy Meyer, they sent people over with some photographs for him to try and identify the female being he saw. He quickly pointed out one photograph saying, that's her, that's her. Apparently the photo he pointed out was of Maria Orsic, the medium from the Brill Society, who was making contact with the Inner Earth group, and who played an intimate role in the pre- and post-World War II German secret space program. End quote. So this is also amazing information, because if it's true, it means that some, I'm not saying all, but some extraterrestrial contact cases may not have involved genuine extraterrestrial beings, but may have involved people like Maria Orsic, who came from Earth, but then because of the German space program, because of its advanced nature and because of its secret success, they were later to come back and pretend that they were extraterrestrials. And then they would meet humans and take them up on their ships and give them a tour of the ship and introduce them to some philosophy, saying that they were from some other star system, like the Bajarans, like Billy Meyer says he was told, but that according to what Corey Good is saying, his information, that these were actually, this was Maria Orsic, that it was discovered that these were humans pretending to be extraterrestrials. Now, one of the things that is very helpful to understand is that in the 1920s in Germany, there were many German inventors, engineers, people who were very open-minded, developing spontaneously these kinds of advanced craft that could be used for teleportation purposes to travel great distances. There was an example in the United States, Otis Carr, who was a protege of Nikola Tesla. Tesla trained Otis Carr in how to build a spacecraft. So Tesla knew how to build a spacecraft, but he was shut down. He was prevented from revealing this to the world. Otis Carr was trained by Tesla to give this to the world, to share this with the world. And Otis Carr did. He built one of these in the Los Angeles area in California. He built one of these teleportation devices that Tesla knew how to build, that Maria Orsic also knew how to build, and that the Germans were building these in the 1920s. In the 1960s, Otis Carr tried to build that because he wanted the United States to have a civilian spacecraft industry, but he was shut down. He was raided by different intelligence agencies in the United States, and everything was confiscated, and he was sent to prison for threatening the US economy. Because that's what would have happened if these craft became widely available. So, in the 1920s, the Brill Society, many open-minded Germans developed these advanced craft, and that they began building them into the 1930s. But then in 1933, Germany underwent a massive shift. It shifted from a very democratic, very open-minded Weimar Republic that tolerated diversity and tolerated kind of openness to the Nazi regime, which we know what that stood for. And what the Nazis did was that they very quickly basically brought under the Nazi control all of these advanced technologies that civilian German scientists and secret societies have been developing. And many of them decided that the only way to continue to work on these technologies, this included Maria Orsich and the Brill Society, was to cooperate with the Nazis, otherwise they would be shut down and thrown into prison. So many of them did cooperate with the Nazis. And this is where the Navy spies say that they learned that during the latter part of the 1930s that Hitler's regime reached an agreement with a group of reptilian extraterrestrials. And that this agreement was something that basically meant that Nazi Germany would become a very imperialistic race, or a very imperialistic entity, government power, and would seek to enslave and conquer lands, because this seemed to be the modus operandi, or the way in which the reptilians operated. But they also had a kind of master-slave philosophy. This was what the Nazi regime developed, a master-slave philosophy, and that was similar to what the reptilian extraterrestrials also believed. So this is happening during the Second World War, that the Nazis are developing these flying saucer craft, and they are being helped by the reptilians. And according to William Tompkins, what happened was that the way the reptilians did it was that they just gave the Nazis, he said, 14 different prototypes, 14 different extraterrestrial craft that the Nazi scientists would reverse engineer for the war effort. And so this was what the Nazis had been given. And so this gives us an idea now, a little bit of background for why the US Navy was gifted these drone flying saucers after the Los Angeles air raid in 1942. That just as the Germans were being helped by this reptilian extraterrestrial race, or Nazi Germany was being helped, the US Navy in particular was being helped by this group of human-looking Nordic extraterrestrials. So in reality, the Second World War was really a proxy war. Not only was it a war involving two major blocks, the Axis powers and the Allied powers, but it involved these two different groups of extraterrestrials, one working with the Axis powers, the reptilians, and the other working with the Allied powers. So the reptilian aliens helped the Germans establish a presence in Antarctica. Antarctica became very important for the German space program that was being developed under Hitler. But the program that was established in Antarctica had a certain degree of independence from the Nazi regime. Because the German secret societies were the ones that were leading the establishment of this presence in Antarctica, and in particular the German Navy. The head of the German Navy intelligence, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, actually was in charge of the German military intelligence during the Second World War. He was a Navy admiral, and he was one of the original sponsors of the Thule Society, because the Thule Society was helpful for the German Navy in building secret submarines during immediately after the First World War in foreign nations. So there's a lot of history to that, and I can't talk about it now in detail, but in my book, the US Navy Secret Space Program, I go into the role of Admiral Canaris and the German Navy in helping set up a German secret space program both in Nazi Germany and in Antarctica. But the Navy, the German Navy and German military intelligence were never fully supportive of Hitler. There was a kind of distrust. There was cooperation, because ultimately the German Navy were nationalists. They weren't Nazi ideologues, and that's a very big difference. The Nazis were ideologues, the German Navy were nationalists. So the German space program that was established in Antarctica was really a form of ultra-German nationalism, but it was not Nazism. There is a difference there. So that's why there was a difference between the Nazi German space program in Germany and what was established in Antarctica. So after the Second World War ended, even though Nazi Germany had been defeated in occupied Europe, the German space program that was really being run by the German Navy and the German secret space programs, with assistance from German corporations and the Nazis, it grew and it developed and it became a very powerful force, small but with very advanced technologies. So that by 1946, 1947, when the US Navy sent a naval task force down to Antarctica to basically take control of the German bases in New Schwabenland, the US Navy suffered a bad defeat. And this is really when things began to take on an ominous side, because up until this time, the US Navy and the US military hadn't experienced defeat. They defeated Nazi Germany, they defeated Imperial Japan, and they thought that the German colony in Antarctica would be easy to defeat because they were quite small. But by early 1947, the US Navy discovered that the Germans had successfully weaponized their flying saucer craft, and that they were now a very powerful force. And so this is when you actually have a lot of sightings beginning in the United States in 1947. Early 1947, defeat of Operation High Jump in Antarctica. By middle of 1947, you have a lot of craft flying over the United States. You have the famous Arnold incident in Washington State, the Roswell crash, many other sightings. Now, this is not to say that these weren't all extraterrestrial craft. This is to say that there was a mixture. That some of these craft were extraterrestrial, but some of them were also Nazi craft operating out of Antarctica. So just think about that. Because one of the things that Admiral Byrd said after Operation High Jump was that in an interview with the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, he said that they had encountered a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole almost instantaneously. So Byrd, and also what we know from William Tompkins, Corey Good, and other whistleblowers or insiders, former insiders in the US aerospace industry, is that many of the craft that were being sighted in the United States in the 1940s were actually German, Nazi or German craft from Antarctica. So this is very important because it means that the German space program out of Antarctica is becoming very powerful, that they can now fly over US territory without fear, without being shot down, and that the US military had stand-down orders, because when they did try to shoot down the German craft, the pilots or the US craft was shot down. So this has been well documented. Timothy Good wrote a good book about this, Need to Know, where he talks about this period when 1940s, 1950s, when there were efforts to shoot down some of the flying saucers, but they always resulted in negative repercussions for the US Air Force. So this shows you the problem that the US military was now experiencing, that the Germans out of Antarctica were flying over major cities. So 1952, this was very important, and this is a kind of very strategic moment in US history, because you can understand the significance of this, if this is true, that according to William Tompkins, Corey Good and others, that some of the flying saucers that flew over Washington DC in the summer of 1952, that these were German flying saucers out of Antarctica. And so if this is true, and this might be very difficult to accept, but if this is true, and I think there's good reason to believe it is true, and I give the reasons in the book, the US Navy Secret Space Program, this meant that essentially the US military could do nothing against the German space program out of Antarctica. They had no choice but to negotiate. They had to strike an agreement with the Germans out of Antarctica, because the Germans now had all of the most important negotiating cards to play. You know, they were able to fly over US cities or US territory with impunity. They were able to fly over the capital of Washington DC without any fear at all. And the US Air Force had to stand down during this incident. So negotiations were conducted, and these were conducted out of Air Force facilities. In 1954, President Eisenhower travelled to Edwards Air Force Base in February. In 1955, he travelled to Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, and this is where the agreements were finalised. And so then, basically, the United States military-industrial complex began to be infiltrated by the German space program, and how they did that was that they began to bring in many more German scientists out of Germany who were like a fifth column under Operation Paperclip. And these German scientists now were pushed into leadership positions. Werner von Braun became the director of the Kennedy, became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center and also you had Kurt de Vries, also another former Nazi, becoming the director of the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. So all of these German scientists, rocket scientists, were now being pushed into senior positions in NASA, in the US military-industrial complex, and in many companies. German scientists coming from Germany were given permanent residency, citizenship, and high-level security clearance very quickly, much more quickly than American scientists. And this was one of the things that was always very puzzling. Why were German scientists given this kind of very fast-track route to citizenship and security clearances? And this is what really happened, because the US Republic really was taken over because of these secret agreements, and the military-industrial complex became compromised by the Nazis. So this was something that was of great concern to the US military, who understood this, especially the Navy. The US Navy knew what was happening. They knew the strategic consequences of the failure of Operation High Jump and what would happen. So they came up with a plan. They had a plan to counter this infiltration of the US military-industrial complex. So I discussed this plan in the book, the US Navy Secret Space Program. So what was the plan? What was the plan that the Navy had, and what did Nordic extraterrestrials have to do with this plan? Why did they choose to work with the US Navy? So this is what happened. So basically, during the Second World War, William Tompkins, his job was to take these briefing packets where the Navy spies were revealing everything that was happening in Nazi Germany, and to take these briefing packets to all of the experimental aircraft facilities in the United States. Wherever there were US scientists or engineers that were capable of understanding some of these advanced technologies that were being developed in Germany, William Tompkins' job was to take these briefing packets to them. And so this shows, this is on the right-hand side. You see these are exit passes that give Tompkins permission to take out briefing packets from Naval Air Station San Diego and to take these to other facilities. And these briefing packets were based on the debriefings of US Navy spies reporting back from Nazi Germany about what the Germans were doing. So Douglas Aircraft Company was right at the center of this. In 1942, early 1942, when the Los Angeles air raid incident happened, the Douglas Aircraft Company was really the leading aircraft company when it came to experimental aircraft research and development in the United States. And so what the head of Douglas Aircraft Company did was that he put together an informal committee of 2 Navy admirals, 2 Army Air Force generals, and 3 Douglas Aircraft Company engineers to discuss the aircraft or the craft that had been recovered from the Los Angeles air raid incident. And so they set up a study group to look at this and come up with a policy to deal with the study of extraterrestrial craft. And that in the Douglas Aircraft Company, the Douglas Aircraft Company set up Project RAND. And Project RAND was set up in October of 1945, and its job was to study all kinds of experimental aircraft that were capable of space flight. So that was the purpose of Project RAND, and it was set up under the Douglas Aircraft Company. And Douglas Aircraft Company was where William Tompkins later worked. So this is where we get more information about the importance of the Douglas Aircraft Company in helping the Navy set up its secret space program. So 1945, Project RAND is set up, and by 1948, 3 years later, Project RAND separates. It separates into the RAND Corporation, which is run by the US Air Force, and you have the what remains of Project RAND is renamed in the Douglas Aircraft Company. It's given a different name. It's now called Advanced Design. And this was a very important split, because what it did was it basically set the US Air Force and the US Navy on different paths in dealing with developing space programs and understanding advanced extraterrestrial technologies and working with the Nazis or the German space program out of Antarctica. The Navy came up with a strategy to deal with this phenomenon. Basically, in my view, studying this, the Navy admirals, they decided that they would create a kind of parallel system in the US where you would have the Air Force working with the Germans in Antarctica to get as much information as they could about what the Germans were doing and try and extract that information so that they could develop their own program, while at the same time the Navy would develop its own space program working with Douglas Aircraft Company with the cooperation of Nordic extraterrestrials. So this was decided by the Navy in 1940, in that period from 1945 to 48, and I think that's why this split occurred. Now, how can we be sure that the Project RAND was actually involved in the study of extraterrestrial technologies? There's a document that was leaked. This is from September 19, 1947, and it shows that the RAND project was studying extraterrestrial artifacts. So this is one of the leaked Majestic documents. This is a document which is allegedly a government document that has been released without official disclosure. So government authorities will still deny that this document is legitimate, but document authentication experts have said that it is genuine. And this document points out that the RAND project, when it was still part of the Douglas Aircraft Company, was in fact studying extraterrestrial technologies. So this document is important because it shows that one, RAND project was very much involved in this kind of extraterrestrial study, and also the Douglas Aircraft Company was at the center of this, because this is where Project RAND was located at the time that this document was released. Project RAND was part of the Douglas Aircraft Company, that the engineers in Douglas were the ones studying extraterrestrial technologies. And the Douglas Aircraft Company was where William Tompkins began working in 1950, shortly after this document was issued. So, as I mentioned, the US Air Force and the US Navy take different approaches. The US Air Force basically justified setting up their own program because they thought, quote, Major General Curtis LeMay, then Deputy Chief of the Air Staff for Research and Development, considered space operations to be an extension of air operations. And so he commissioned a RAND study which basically justified the creation of an Air Force space program that would be completely separate to what the Navy was doing. So this is what happened, and this was the study that came out of Project RAND while it was part of Douglas Aircraft Company. It was the first proposal for setting up space surveillance, manned space surveillance craft, or space stations, to monitor things on the Earth. So there you have the US Air Force, the National Reconnaissance Office, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, setting up the secret space program, which continues to today, where they are focusing on space surveillance. The US Navy, in contrast, is interested in developing aircraft carriers, flying aircraft carriers, and space carriers. In 1931 to 1933, the US Navy had two flying aircraft carriers. Two, the USS Akron and the USS Macon. And these were dirigible, hard edge or surface dirigible craft that were aircraft carriers. And these were flying at the time. Whoops. Okay, here we are. So this shows you the aircraft landing on this flying aircraft carrier in 1931-33. So this shows that even in the early 1930s that the Navy was very interested in developing flying aircraft carriers. So it supports what William Tompkins says, that by the 1950s, the Navy is very interested in developing flying aircraft carriers for space. So, and I mentioned already how the RAND project separated into this different factions. One working with the US Air Force under the RAND project, so under the RAND Corporation, and the other working with Douglas Aircraft Company. And Bill Tompkins writes in his book, quote, I had been flying up to Douglas from Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego, since spring of 1943. Now, 7 years later, it had been over a year since the divorce. The atmosphere in the tank was thick with overwhelming tension and resentment. The personnel who had been forced to stay with the family, Douglas Aircraft Company, were hit the hardest. Those who wanted to stay but who had to leave also had strong feelings. So this is the split. This is when the Douglas Aircraft Company, which ran Project RAND, had to split it. One side working with the Air Force, one side working with the Navy, and the Project RAND, the engineers and the scientists, they didn't know this, and so they were very upset with the split. But there was a strategic reason for this, as I mentioned. So from 1951 to 1963, William Tompkins worked at the advanced design under Elmer Wheaton and Dr. Wilhelm Klemperer, where UFOs and anti-gravity technology was studied for designing future US Navy space battle groups. So this is a document that shows that the Navy, Douglas Aircraft Company was studying unconventional propulsion systems, including anti-gravity. So this document is dated from 1955. So this is a legitimate document from Douglas Aircraft Company showing that Douglas was studying anti-gravity principles at the time. Now, William Tompkins describes the process, but it's a detailed process by which the Navy was getting Douglas Aircraft Company to come up with these unsolicited bids where Tompkins and other personnel in Douglas would come up with designs for space battle groups. So, just as you have an aircraft battle group with an aircraft carrier, a cruiser, destroyers, minesweepers, escort ships, what the Navy had in mind was to do exactly the same thing in space. In deep space, you would have space battle groups run by the US Navy. So that's what they were planning to do, and this was the design for a kind of large space carrier, and it would have been several kilometres in length. And here you see the USS Akron, which was about 800 feet long, and compared to the space carrier that could carry all sorts of supplies and freight for this space battle group that would be deployed deep in space. William Tompkins described the modular construction process, but you could read about that in the book if you're interested more in the engineering of these. Right, there we go. So now he gives the design of one of the flagships, where the admiral, the space admiral, the Navy space admiral, who would be in charge of the battle group, this would be his flagship. And so you see the information at the bottom that William Tompkins provided for this bid to the Navy. It says Naval Galactic Battle Group, flagship, battle cruiser class flag, anti-gravitation engines from Douglas Advanced Design. So 1.6 kilometres. So we're talking about a craft that was a mile length. And so this, as you can see smaller craft, triangle craft. This was the plan. Eventually they would have these small triangle craft that would be the craft that would deploy from these space battle groups. So here you have the triangle craft design for how they would enter and lead this flagship, this space flagship for the Navy battle group. So how was William Tompkins and the engineers in the Douglas Aircraft Company able to do this? How were they able to develop very large space battle groups? According to William Tompkins, they were being helped. They were being helped by these Nordic extraterrestrials. He says that the Nordic extraterrestrials began to infiltrate US society, and that they infiltrated the Douglas Aircraft Company, and that one of these, actually there were three of them, that were helping William Tompkins when he was working at Douglas Aircraft Company. And this is how one of them looked. He said that they were very beautiful people. There were two females and one male working at the Douglas Aircraft Company. Very beautiful beings. They would look like movie stars. And that they were helping him telepathically with the designs for these space battle groups. So that these Nordic women, especially this one, he says her name was Jessica. He says that Jessica would telepathically give him information for designing these space battle groups, or whenever they had a problem in the design or the engineering of one of these space battle groups or one of the craft, she would help. That they would get help in that way. That was how these Nordic extraterrestrials were helping the Navy. They weren't helping by giving the Navy ships and saying, "Here, you study this." In total, I mean, that happened in 1942 with the drones. But when it came to these large craft, the Navy was helping by giving information to engineers, designers who could come up with the design for these craft. That's how the Nordic extraterrestrials did. Now, is there independent evidence of this? Tompkins says Nordic extraterrestrials infiltrated Douglas Aircraft Company and other companies in the 1950s and in the 1960s to help the Navy build a secret space program. Well, were they being helped? Were these extraterrestrials infiltrating human society in this way? Well, we know a number of contactees. Howard Menger was one of them. He described a number of extraterrestrial encounters beginning at 10 when he met an attractive Nordic extraterrestrial as well. So he says one of these beautiful human-looking extraterrestrials came to him, and she kind of looked like that, very attractive. And so he met her, and that he was later on approached by this same group of extraterrestrials that wanted him to help these human-looking extraterrestrials infiltrate human society. So he said, quote, in one of his books, he says, "Often I purchased clothing and took it to the point of contact. Visitors just arriving from other planets had to be attired in terrestrial clothing so they could pass unnoticed among people," end quote. So he was giving clothing, advice about how to speak colloquial American, information on the American mannerisms and behaviour that would help extraterrestrials to infiltrate without being noticed. So this was happening according to Menger. Also, according to Robert Dean, who was Command Sergeant Major for the US Army, a very senior position in the enlisted branch of the US Army, he says the same thing, that there was a document called the assessment that in 1964 he had access to, and it said that the biggest threat, that a big threat that NATO had was human extraterrestrials infiltrating the military and political institutions. So this is pretty much what William Tompkins said was happening at Douglas Aircraft Company, and that he was working with these human extraterrestrials that had infiltrated Douglas. So what did the Nordic extraterrestrials want? Why were they doing this? Why were they helping the US Navy develop space battle groups? According to Tompkins, they did it because they wanted the US Navy to become future allies, where they would support these Nordic extraterrestrials in a galactic empire. So not only did we have a proxy war between different groups of extraterrestrials during the Second World War, but after the Second World War, we had a proxy war happening unofficially between the German space program in Antarctica working with reptilians and the US Navy and its European allies and other allies around the world that were working with Nordic extraterrestrials. So the US Navy was helped by the Nordics to build space battle groups. So that's a phenomenal insight that William Tompkins has provided us, and I think that he's provided a lot of evidence, a lot of documents to support that this really did happen, and a lot of corroborating witness testimony from others suggests that this was happening. So now the question, and I think some of you probably have this question, why the contrast with the Space Brothers? George Adamski, in this picture, he was visited by Orthon, who was from Venus, and Orthon from Venus was basically telling Adamski that humanity was too warlike, we had to be more peaceful, we had to give up our development of nuclear weapons, and we had to develop a more spiritual philosophy before we got these advanced disruptive technologies. So Adamski meets a master of wisdom in this book. This is from Venus, this master of wisdom from Venus. So he's told that human society is too aggressive and that advanced technology will not be shared, otherwise it would be weaponized. So the emphasis is on consciousness raising. And then we have South American contactees, and I'm very pleased that we have some of the presenters that have already been talking about some of these contact cases from South America, because I think that they are very, very important, and I'm very pleased to see that. Here you have a drawing of Antarel, who has been working with some of the contactees from South America, Ricardo Gonzalez, Luis Fernando. Those are the ones that I'm aware of that work with Antarel, who is part of this group of extraterrestrials that emphasize consciousness raising, that humanity is not ready for advanced technologies yet, and so they want first of all, that we develop ethically, raise our consciousness, and then we'll be ready for more advanced technologies, and that they'll be happy to share these technologies later. So this is what South American contactees are saying. Sixto Paz Wells, he'll be talking, I guess, tomorrow or the next day, and I'm sure he'll talk about the cosmic plan, and I think this very nicely illustrates this perspective of the human-looking extraterrestrials that have been working with the South American contactees, that we need to raise our consciousness, develop more of an ethical outlook before we're ready for advanced technologies. So this leads to a problem then. So why the difference? Why is one group of extraterrestrials saying, raise your consciousness, develop ethically, you're not ready for advanced technologies, and another group is developing, helping a major branch of the US military develop advanced space technologies that could be used in a future galactic war? Why the contrast? How could this be possible? Well, there's a contactee, Robert Renaud, that Wendell Stevens worked with very closely, and I've spoken with Robert Renaud, and I think he's a very credible contactee from the United States. And he worked with a group of extraterrestrials that describe themselves as Corembians, and that they worked with something called an alliance of worlds. And this federation, or this alliance of worlds, was very interventionist. They wanted to get involved in problems and fight against those doing evil things or trying to undermine peaceful relations in the galaxy or between planets. But there was the other group, which is the Galactic Confederation, which are more pacifist, more non-interventionist. That they think that it's better to kind of like raise consciousness, behave ethically, and that in that way you will be able to transcend the problems that afflict humanity. So very different approaches by two different groups of human-looking extraterrestrials. And according to Robert Renaud, that these two different groupings of human-looking extraterrestrials, while they have respect for one another, they have very different philosophies. So in a way, this illustrates the attitude between, say, the European Union and the United States when it comes to dealing with trouble spots like the former Yugoslavia when there was the breakdown of the war. The European Union wanted to promote dialogue, conflict resolution, whereas the United States was very much more interested in basically, sending in warplanes to kind of like force the parties to the negotiating table. Very different philosophies, but this I think shows us that just as we have differences between major nations that we consider democratic and developed, so too extraterrestrials that we might think are very similar to us, they also have very strong philosophical and political differences in how they deal with problems, and planets like ours, which is a very difficult planet because of all of the advanced technologies that exist. So there is Alex Collier, who talks about the kind of strategic imperative here. He's a contactee from the United States. I think also he's very credible. He said, quote, "There is no such thing as self-rule in the Orion Empire." That's the reptilian. The Orion Empire is the reptilian empire. "There is only one nation on earth with experience in self-rule, the United States. This is why the focus is on destroying the United States. This is the reason the Andromedans are coming back, because some 300 years into our future there is tyranny. There's all been traced back to our solar system. We're in the middle of it." So this gives us an idea of the strategic imperatives here, that 300 years in our future, extraterrestrials find a galactic tyranny, and they find the origin of that galactic tyranny events on Earth in our era. And this is why they're intervening. This is why they are helping the Navy, US Navy, I believe, in dealing with this threat out of Antarctica that the German space program has been able to flourish with the cooperation of these reptilians out of Antarctica. That if that program out of Antarctica is not neutralized or countered, then in 300 years in the future there will be galactic tyranny. And I think this is why the Nordic extraterrestrials, some of them have been intervening in this way to help the Navy and its allies around the world develop a secret space program with these battle groups. Another American contactee, Tolek, also talks about this kind of strategic imperative where some Nordic extraterrestrials are actually attacking reptilian bases that have been secretly set up on the Earth. So here he talks about Draco and Hydro reptilian undersea bases being destroyed by this alliance of interventionist extraterrestrials. And another contactee, Cobra, who operates in Europe, I don't even know if he's here, or some of the people here may actually be supporters of Cobra. He says very much the same thing, that this alliance of extraterrestrials, he calls it the Resistance, has been attacking these reptilian bases that have been set up around the world and basically destroying them. Because that will help the Earth become free of this kind of reptilian German influence. Corey Good, he talks about an alliance, a super federation, where all of the human-looking extraterrestrials, he says there's between 40 to 60 of these different extraterrestrial civilizations all come together to have these super federation council meetings. And Corey has described how he's attended some of these meetings and in different capacities. And my first book, Insiders Reveal Secret Space Programs, goes into depth about Corey being involved as a liaison for the Solar Warden Secret Space Program with this super federation, and more recently for the Sphere Being Alliance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So now, Russia. What's the role of Russia in all of this? Well, Russia is a very important country. Russia has been, was part of the alliance, obviously, that fought against Nazi Germany during the Second World War. And they were being helped, as was the United States Navy, by these extraterrestrials to counter the Germans. But because the Soviet Union had a very totalitarian system in place, that mitigated, or that prevented full-scale cooperation between the Nordics and the Soviet Union. So it was only with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that you have this happening. That is, the Russian Federation begins to work much more closely with the Nordics who have infiltrated Russia. That just as the United States was infiltrated by these Nordic extraterrestrials trying to help the United States Navy and companies like Douglas Aircraft to develop advanced technologies to deal with this German program out of Antarctica, so too the Russians from the early 1990s began to do this as well, under Yeltsin and then under Putin in 1999. There's evidence for this. In 1997, there was a meeting between Kirsan Lumshinov, who was the president of the president of the World Chess Federation, and also the president of the Republic of Kalmykia in Russia. So a very senior politician, head of the Russian republics, and he had meetings with extraterrestrials. And he said at the very bottom, he described his meeting with these extraterrestrials, these human-looking extraterrestrials. Quote, "They are people like us. They have the same mind, the same vision. I talk with them. I understand that we are not alone in this world. We are not unique." End quote. Well, he was allowed to go onto Russian TV to talk about his encounters while he continued to hold these very important positions later in the 2000s under Putin's administration. And this was because Putin wanted this information to come out, that he wanted Russians to know that there are extraterrestrials that are working with Russia. And this was a way of doing that, because Lumshinov was never punished for doing this. In the United States, any politician that openly started talking about meeting human-looking extraterrestrials and that they are friends, that they're just like us, he would be very quickly booted out of the system, because, as I mentioned earlier, the US has been compromised at an institutional level. The military-industrial congressional complex is controlled by this German group in Antarctica, has been for a long time, but there are groups within the United States, led by the Navy, with the support of the Marines and other kind of white hats in the military, who are basically working with these Nordics to try and free the United States from this kind of oppression that is being led by the Germans out of Antarctica.
5 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to have to move quickly. So the Russian PM also discusses extraterrestrials amongst us. So this is where this was a hot microphone incident, where he says he had the codes for human-looking extraterrestrials. So I'll just move quickly so I can get to kind of like the end here. So advanced extraterrestrials. Okay, so we have that. So these advanced extraterrestrials are helping the Solar Warden and Secret Space Program Alliance with defensive technologies. So the aim is to help the Navy and the Russians and others that are trying to deal with this threat humanity is facing, this hidden threat, by giving them advanced technologies, but these are more defensive in nature rather than offensive. So in early 2016, Corey Good describes a battle in Antarctica where you have this alliance between the Russian and the Earth Alliance combating this space program that is based in Antarctica that is being run by the Germans, the reptilians, and the US military-industrial complex, which has been compromised. So basically, according to Corey, the Sphere Being Alliance is this group of 6th to 9th density consciousness beings who are leveling the playing field, who are trying to help both sides reach parity in terms of destructive weapons so that then negotiations can happen. So they have a kind of philosophy that as long as you have a technological imbalance, then genuine negotiations don't happen. Once the technology is similar, then there'll be negotiations. And that's apparently what they're trying to do here. Now, because of time, I'm going to skip through this, but the US Air Force has been investigating claims of the secret Navy space program. Because as I mentioned, the Air Force and the Navy separated back in the 1940s. The Air Force setting up its program, the Navy setting up its program. And there was a strategic reason for this, but the Navy knew it, but the Air Force didn't. Because the Air Force is the junior service in the United States. They don't know as much as the Navy. So the Air Force officials are investigating, well, is there such a thing as a Navy service? So they interrogated people, and they reached the conclusion. There were two things, two possibilities. One, there was a visiting group of Nordic extraterrestrials known to the military-industrial complex secret space program that is manipulating Corey through mind control and feeding him accurate information for an unknown agenda. Two, Corey is associated with a Navy-run secret space program, which is part of the Secret Space Program Alliance, and he's working with a visiting group of extraterrestrials called the Sphere Being Alliance, which is what he says. Okay, so how many more minutes do I have? How many more minutes?
3 minutes.
3, thank you. Okay, so I'll move quickly. Early this year, there was a document released by the Defense Intelligence Agency, allegedly from, this is the premier US military spy agency, and it talked about Nordic extraterrestrials. For the first time, the US Air Force was talking about human-looking extraterrestrials. Now this Defense Intelligence Agency document refers to human-looking extraterrestrials. This is the first time that this has ever happened. And they talk about these Earth-like humanoids. There are several variations, more or less like ourselves. The majority of these are friendly and are the bulk of our extraterrestrial biological entity contacts. Most have a high degree of psychic ability and all use science and engineering of an advanced nature. You can look at this on my website, exopolitics.org. So I talk about cylindrical UFOs, President Trump visiting MacDill Air Force Base, talking about new technologies for the Air Force. Soon after that, you have these flying triangles being seen over the MacDill Air Force Base. Go to the website, exopolitics.org, to read this. Hurricane Irma, that this was actually steered to MacDill Air Force Base, where the Air Force has its some of its secret space program facilities, and where some of its covert operatives are working with these Nordic extraterrestrials. So now what's happening is that the Nordics have begun working with the US Air Force. Okay, so the Vatican is involved in this as well. Again, not enough time, but you can go to my website to read about the Vatican involvement in all of this. Corey says that this is a possibility very soon, that the Vatican is ready to do this, that you might have Nordic extraterrestrials announcing their presence from St. Peter's Square. World religions unite as disclosure moves forward. Are all human-looking extraterrestrials friendly? Are they to be trusted? No. Some of them can't be trusted because they work for the other side. This is one group, the tall whites, that do work for the other side. I've talked about them on my website there. Also, Corey talks about them on December 11 and also says they are not to be trusted. So not all human-looking extraterrestrials are to be trusted. According to Corey, there are 4 groups that are human-looking, looking like us. I've got 7 slides, I'll go real quick. And according to Corey, the extraterrestrials are brothers and sisters of the Confederation, so they can be trusted. So some human-looking extraterrestrials are our friends, they can be trusted, they can be worked with, and they're working with various military groups. The Nordics are working with the Navy, the Russians, and of course with private citizens, and with the South American contactees. So there are different factions, different groups of extraterrestrials here. We need to make the right choices, who to work with, who are our friends, who are our foes. We need to be discerning, we need to know this, because this is going to be important for the future, in terms of how we as private citizens make choices about which extraterrestrial groups are friends or not, who to work with, who to support. 2 more slides. So we are now on the verge of a global transformation, because we know there are positive extraterrestrials working with us, that there's this group of the Sphere Being Alliance trying to encourage a process whereby we transform the planet to move forward. So we, everyone in this room, we're vehicles for presenting a revolutionary global narrative of truth, friendship, harmony with our Nordic, ET, Inner Earth, and Sphere Being Alliance friends. We need to create the optimal timeline, the best path forward. How do we do that? This is what I think we can do. We need to have the disclosure event's going to happen soon. The planet is going to be overwhelmed when they realise the truth about many of the things I've been discussing. Many people are going to be very, very angry, and this is not a good thing. We need to be in a place where we need to combine principles of truth and forgiveness. When we learn the truth, we need to be ready to forgive those who did terrible things. Justice and mercy. We need to find justice for those who have been tremendously harmed by the secrecy and the abuses that have happened. But also to have mercy for those who did these things, because often they were in situations where it was like you follow orders or you die. I mean, as simple as that. So they're the 2 books that discuss all of this. Thank you for your patience, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Y Zapatero hablaba de alianza de civilizaciones. Bueno, supongo que a partir de ahora el concepto aquel que Ronald Reagan trasladó en las Naciones Unidas de qué bueno sería que tuviéramos un enemigo extraterrestre, porque así todos nos uniríamos, y puso en marcha el plan de la guerra de las galaxias, toma una dimensión desconocida. No os veo a ninguno y tenemos unos minutos para preguntas. Por ahí veo manos, las intuyo más bien. Ahora os decía que el poder mental conseguiría que viéramos bien las diapos, y no me he equivocado, ¿eh? A ver, por allí. Salla.
Thank you for your lecture, Dr. Salla. I've got a question. Have you got any informers that came forward recently that confirmed, this kind of story that William Thompson and Corey do? Because this is, this is very important to
Yes.
realize, for people, that that's true. I believe in this. So, I believe in this.
Yes, there's a couple of people that haven't been revealed yet. They're still anonymous. One is a former officer, military officer, very highly credentialed, very good records, and he says he served in a 20 back secret space program for the US Marine Corps, and he was a senior officer, and he's ready, just about ready to come forward, and he has a lot of documents supporting what he said, and that basically he said that that the US Marine Corps set up a system whereby when the secrecy system got out of control, when it ceased to be ethical and the US Republic was threatened from within, which is what happens now, that the Marine Corps would be that the Marine Corps and the Navy would be the military service that would actually reveal the truth to the American public. And that's what's happening now. And another source out of MacDill, lives near MacDill Air Force Base. He's taking photographs. He's being given help to take photographs of some of the Air Force and some of the secret space program vehicles that are operating out of MacDill Air Force Base. And also being shown the cigar-shaped ships that actually are extraterrestrial. So he has those photos, and I'm putting them up on the website now, so you can read up there.
One more question. Here.
Buenas, usted ha nombrado a Bob Dylan.
Un momentito, que le ponemos el traductor a Salla.
Ah, sí,
Bien, usted ha dicho que ha nombrado a Bob Dylan. Quisiera saber si le conoce y qué posibilidades cree que tiene de ser un desinformador. Y luego una segunda pregunta, ¿qué pasa con Trump en todo este asunto?
Right, this military officer, yes, I know him personally. I've vetted him, as have a number of others that have vetted him, and he's given us a lot of documents that we've been able to study, and that when he comes forward, these documents will be released. But he was a very decorated Army officer. He's worked in a number of professions. I don't want to say too much because he still wants to be anonymous. Yes, he has worked with the military, special forces in the military, and also with the US police force, and also with the United Nations as well, at a level. But this is part of the documentation that will be released. I've vetted him, Corey Wood has vetted him, Gaia TV has vetted him. So we've looked over his documents, and he's very solid, and it's very fortunate because we just lost William Tompkins just 3 weeks ago, so that was a very big loss for all of us. But this gentleman is now going to come forward with his own documents, and that will help bring a lot of military people and a lot of police in the United States and internationally on board, because many of them don't know that this sounds like science fiction, what I've said. But when you have very highly credentialed people saying, yes, I worked in this secret space program, that the 20 and Back program is real, I worked for it, and they have documents showing that they work for the Army, they work for the Marines, they work for the United Nations, they work for the different police forces in the US. People like that have a lot of credibility.
One more, Christian.
Yeah, I have another question, Michael. I have a question. Is another name for this Nordic people in the German genetic is a name Ariani, going out from the third world and going in the past and coming now back to us. Is this correct?
That's a very interesting question. Corey talks about that the inner earth beings are actually our future selves that went back in time, and that they are here to kind of like guide us through this critical period in our history. And that actually has a lot of merit to it. It makes a lot of sense. Why they know so much about us, and they are helping. And this is one of the groups that has given Corey a lot of information. And he's here, and maybe he'll talk about that, because apparently Montserrat actually is a very important place for this inner earth civilization, that they operate here, and maybe Corey will have a message for us from them when he speaks tomorrow.
De hecho, tendremos oportunidad de escuchar a Cory en unos minutos, porque después de las preguntas en la mesa redonda tenemos oportunidad también de preguntarle. Sí.
Hi. I want to ask you, you have been talking about Nordic ETs, and it's supposed all of them are positive, but it's said that there are someone which one are negative, and I wanted to talk about this, please, and talk too about the Nordic people, which one is in the Friendship Island in Chile. If you know something about that.
The easiest way to distinguish between the different Nordic...
It's like friendship.
Oh, the friendship case. Oh, thank you. Yes, I know about the friendship case. The easiest way to distinguish between the different Nordic groups is how you feel around them. Groups that make you feel intimidated and frightened, these are not positive groups. Groups that make you feel safe or make you feel loved, it doesn't have to be loved, it just make you feel calm, peaceful, and relaxed, where your critical thinking is elevated, those are positive groups. So it's really, it's all about us exercising emotional intelligence. How do we feel if we meet one of these human-looking extraterrestrials? If they make us feel fearful, intimidated, then we need to be careful. If they, you can go too much the other way too. People warn about if you get blissed out. If you get blissed out, where it's like you just can't think properly, you just feel so good and loving. That's not good either, because you have to find the balance. You have to feel calm, peaceful, but also your critical thinking is elevated, not dampened in any way. If you get blissed out, your critical thinking is dampened. So there's a balance there, but that's how I would recommend to distinguish between them.
Vamos con la última cuestión, the last question.
I have a question. So you said that you feel like some type of disclosure is going to happen soon. So could you maybe elaborate on the science and maybe on the latest intel you have about the possible event of disclosure, whether it's in partial disclosure or full disclosure?
Right. Well, it's very significant in my mind, having studied this for a long time now, that the US Air Force, or at least this Defense Intelligence Agency document that was leaked, talks about the US military, the Air Force and the Defense Intelligence Agency now regard Nordic-looking humans, human-looking extraterrestrials as friendly and positive. That's a big breakthrough, because it means now that the Air Force is ready to work with the Navy in a disclosure of extraterrestrial life amongst us. And so now you actually have the US military, rather than being separate, they're now coming together, which is why what's happening down at MacDill Air Force Base is important, because this is the hub of Special Operations Command, which is one of the most important military commands in the US. They have 10 commands, but Special Operations Command is based in MacDill, in Tampa, Florida, and this is where the Hurricane Irma was sent. It was sent to reveal a message. It was basically, Irma is derived from the German word for goddess, of war goddess, and it hit MacDill Air Force Base, Tampa, on the beginning of 9/11. And there are basically, it was directed there to send a message to the US military that if you continue to move forward with disclosure, this is the start of a new 9/11 with weather warfare. And so, to me, that's a sign that we are going to have disclosure, because now the military is allowing craft to be photographed near MacDill Air Force Base, and more people are being allowed or encouraged to come forward to reveal what they know.
No more questions. Thank you, Dr. Salla, for your presentation in this Congress. Nosotros nos volvemos a ver en 15 minutos. El profesor Salla puede firmar libros, si ustedes lo desean, en las mesas en 15 minutos. retomamos con la mesa redonda en la que...